All right, friends, welcome to another edition of Justice Matters One on One. I am thrilled to have Dr. Annie Andrews with us today. As you may know, she is running for Senate in South Carolina, running against Lindsey Graham, somebody who, at least for me, whose name is synonymous with flip flopping, with shamelessly, having inconsistent opinions. And, he is somebody who I think is an embarrassment to the Senate. And so I'm thrilled to be able to sit down with Dr. Andrews today and talk about her campaign and her candidacy. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a pediatrician, not a politician. And as far as I'm concerned, that goes a long way to recommending her to the Senate. And I love what she has on her website. She says, Washington needs some healing. And I don't think anybody could disagree with that. As she says on her website directly, even bluntly, she's running for Senate because kids and parents across the state are getting screwed by a system designed to work for the powerful, not the rest of us. So, Doc, I didn't mean to steal your thunder, but the first question is, why did you decide, as a lifelong physician, pediatrician, why did you decide to jump into the Senate race?
Well, thank you for having me, Glenn. And, you really illustrated very well the problems with Lindsey Graham. He, to me, epitomizes the problem with the modern day Republican Party. He is a career corrupt politician who's been in the U.S. Senate for 22 years, which is literally half of my lifetime. And I, as you said, am a doctor, not a career politician. I've worked for nearly 20 years in children's hospitals, never planned to pivot into politics. But when you go to work every day in a children's hospital, you can't help but notice the impacts of broken policies coming out of Washington, D.C., and how they impact our kids and families before they ever even get to the doors of a children's hospital. I'm talking about kids who are hungry, don't know where their next meal is coming from, kids whose parents can't afford their prescription drugs, kids who have to spend the night in the hospital room alone because their parents are juggling multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and kids who've been shot. So, after nearly 2 decades of doing that work, I realized I had to do more to address these systemic problems that were facing my patients. I got off the sidelines in a very dramatic way. Some may know that back in 2022, I ran against our nation's most embarrassing Congresswoman, Nancy Mace, down here in South Carolina's first district. I didn't win, but I didn't go away. And I realized that Lindsey Graham has got to go. He is the worst of the worst. He's not serving South Carolinians, and we deserve so much better. So that's why I decided to get in this race.
And of course, Lindsey Graham is one of the many Republicans who voted in favor of, I don't call it the big, beautiful bill, although I will use BBB, the, big bullshit bill, which, let's face it, is going to hurt Americans. So, as a physician, what do you see as the health implications to the American people and to children all across America as a result of this bill?
Yes, widespread and unprecedented dismantling of the backbone of our nation's healthcare system, which is the Medicaid program. Medicaid is the largest insurer for children in this country. Medicaid funds nearly 50% of the births in South Carolina, 6 out of 10 nursing home beds. You cannot take this much money out of a system and expect the system to continue to function. I've been talking a lot about this on the trail because a lot of people think, well, I don't have Medicaid or no one in my family has Medicaid. This won't affect me. But this impacts every single person who uses our healthcare system. Because when patients lose their health insurance, they lose access to primary and preventative care. But they still get sick and they still get injured. And what happens is they wait longer to go to the doctor when they do get sick or when they do get hurt because they know they don't have health insurance. And then they go to the one place that is legally required to provide them with care, and that is our emergency departments. So our emergency departments are going to be overrun. They're going to be understaffed because even though these Medicaid cuts don't go into effect until 2026 after the midterm elections, hospitals are already looking at their bottom line and they understand they're going to have to compensate for this giant hole in their budget. And they're going to do that by slowly freezing hiring, firing staff, shutting down service lines, offering fewer services. Rural hospitals are going to close. And then Those of us with private insurance are going to see our premiums rise imminently because that's the only way that hospitals can cover this huge hole in their budget that we're going to get from this BBB.
Yeah, and I've heard projections that as many as 17 million Americans could lose their health care. As you said, rural hospitals will probably have to be shuttered, with cutting SNAP and food assistance programs. You're almost literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry children. And yet, the Lindsey Grahams of the world and the rest of the Republican Party somehow believes this strikes the right balance, which to anybody with even an ounce of compassion or empathy or decency, I can't for the life of me understand.
I totally agree with you. I mean, they're literally, as you said, ripping food off the plates of hungry children. And I think it's really important for Democrats to point out the fact that they're not doing this because they're concerned about balancing the budget or concerned about the debt or the deficit. They're doing this to deliver tax cuts to their billionaire donors and to corporate PACs. So it is deeply corrupt and immoral. And we should all be moved to use our voices to fight back against this unprecedented and coordinated attack on our healthcare system and the entire social safety net in this country.
So, Dr. Andrews, let me shift the focus a little bit to gun violence, an issue I know that's near and dear to your heart that you've focused on. You've treated, I'm sure, countless gunshot wound victims, including many children's. As a former career prosecutor, 22 of my 30 years was working murder cases in the courts of Washington, D.C., both federal and local. And I have to tell you, the number of autopsy reports I dealt with or my homicide prosecutors dealt with, when you look at the cause of death being gunshot wound as compared to every other cause of death, sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma, asphyxiation, manual strangulation, arson, incineration, poison, all of them combined a fraction of the gunshot wound deaths in Washington, D.C. And yet you have a Republican Party that seems far more interested in restricting books than restricting bullets and firearms. Again, the callousness of the position that the Republican Party always seems to take on gun reform. Common sense gun reform is inexplicable to me. But if you were elected to the Senate, what proposals would you bring? How would you try to get at the gun violence epidemic in America?
I feel your passion coming through the screen, and that's exactly how I feel because for me, it really took standing at the bedside of one child with bullet holes in them to know that I needed to do more. And the good news is the majority of Americans agree with us that we need common sense gun reform in this country. And the only place we can't get a consensus is in the US Senate, where folks like Lindsey Graham are more than willing to cash their checks from the NRA but will ignore their constituency when we talk about gun violence, which is the leading cause of death for children in South Carolina and the leading cause of death for children all across this country. My number one policy priority on this issue is passing universal background checks. Over 90% of Americans agree that we need universal background checks. Right now, over 50% of the gun sales in this country occur without a background check because they occur privately. This is how guns end up in the wrong hands. We need to start there. And then with that success, we can move on to pass a federal red flag law, a federal child access prevention or secure storage law. We need to increase funding for gun violence prevention research, and we need to increase funding for hospital and community based violence intervention programs. One of the most heartbreaking things about Harrison Walls losing in November was seeing the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention shutting down. It was seeing the Trump administration rescind the Surgeon General declaring gun violence to be a public health crisis because we were finally making progress on this public health crisis. And now that is all just being wiped away. A lot of great gun violence prevention organizations are doing work at the state and local level because we're waiting for that federal watershed moment. People ask me in South Carolina, am I going to talk about this issue on the trail? It's South Carolina. Is that really smart? Absolutely. Because as I already said, over 90% of Americans are with us on this. And the only place we can't get consensus is in the US Senate. So we need to start electing folks who have some moral courage and are willing to, have a backbone and use it to pass the laws that so many of us so desperately want.
So with the parade of horribles, right? We're living in the Trump-induced darkness right now, as facilitated by the Republican Party. If you had to try to pick one, and I know it's not easy, one issue that is sort of the most dramatic and important issue facing America right now, what would you say that issue is?
I mean, it's hard to answer that question without saying defending our democracy. We're seeing it dismantled in real time. We're only less than a half a year into this administration, and I'm deeply concerned about the erosion of what should be the guardrails on our democracy, the justice system, the Department of Justice. And deeply concerned about where we will be in 4 years if we don't have a decisive midterm election. But in addition to shoring up our democracy, I believe that healthcare will be the lead issue in the 2026 election cycle because it touches everyone. And we've already seen this unprecedented coordinated attack on our healthcare system that will impact us. We talk about affordability a lot. And I think Democrats who want to win elections need to talk about affordability every day. But one of the main drivers of affordability is healthcare costs because we pay these outrageous premiums. We see prescription drug prices rising, our copays are rising. We've got to get the system under control. So it's going to be healthcare, but we also have to save our democracy while we're at it.
Yeah, the health of American democracy and the health of the American people kind of go hand in hand. One without the other, either way, is a recipe for disaster.
That's right.
So let me ask you this before I want to touch on a couple of rule of law questions because I'm a rule of law guy. I'm not a political guy. But shifting now to South Carolina, what do you think the two or three most pressing issues for the people of South Carolina are? What will you go to the Senate and, fight for, when you first get there for the people of South Carolina?
My number one policy priority is to pass an expanded and permanent child tax credit, which we really should have broad bipartisan support for. I think we should all be a little bit ashamed that we don't have bipartisan support for this simple, cost effective policy solution that, when in effect during COVID, lifted millions of American children out of poverty. So I see that as sort of resetting the foundation of children's well-being in the state of South Carolina. And what's the good news is what's good for kids is good for families, is good for the economy. So if we were to pass an expanded and permanent child tax credit, families who are struggling to make ends meet in South Carolina would immediately get some relief. In addition to that, we have to defend slash rebuild the Medicaid program that is currently being dismantled. South Carolina never even expanded Medicaid. So we already have so many unfunded or underfunded vulnerable patients in the state of South Carolina who now are going to lose access to their regional rural hospital. And this is going to become a critical issue as we see emergency departments overcrowded, as we see people lacking access to preventative routine care that will detect cancers earlier. And this is all going to drive up the cost of healthcare. So I think to best serve the folks in South Carolina, I have to address affordability by expanding the child tax credit and also address access to healthcare. But we could talk for hours about the problems facing folks in South Carolina. We've had a state run by Republicans for decades, and we're on the bottom of every ranking list you could ever imagine. And we have to start somewhere. We have to start winning elections so we can deliver results for folks in South Carolina.
Yeah, and it feels like dislodging Lindsey Graham, who is such a creature of Washington in the worst sense of that term, would be an excellent start for the people of South Carolina. Let me ask you a couple of rule of law questions and just get your top line thoughts. And these are all kind of related. But first of all, your top line thought regarding the state of our Department of Justice, which was my beloved professional home for nearly a quarter of a century and I don't recognize it these days. But what are your top line thoughts about DOJ?
I mean, as someone who's on the outside, who's been just working in hospitals my entire career, I am deeply distressed and disturbed by this erosion of what I always thought would be is the bedrock of the freedom that we all love as Americans. We're seeing just unprecedented attacks and political usage of the Department of Justice. And, I don't think I ever thought I would see corruption run this deep. And I feel the same way as I feel about science. I never thought politics should erode the guardrails of science, just like I thought our Department of Justice was a safe space. But we've seen politics infiltrate science and we've seen it infiltrate the Department of Justice. And with those two guardrails gone, I've been saying this for a really long time. I'm just so worried about where we could end up if we don't get this right in 2026.
Well, now that you raised the erosion of science in the federal government, let me detour for a minute out of the rule of law questions. But RFK Jr. and what he is doing to the American people, what are your top line thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, him being appointed to lead the Department of Health and Human Services really was that final nudge I needed to decide to run in 2026 because this is a worst case scenario for anyone who cares about children's health or anyone who's been engaged in the provision of children's health care in this country. He is a grifter and a conspiracy theorist who has no business near the Department of Health and Human Services. That man doesn't understand basic statistics, he doesn't understand research principles. He's diverting funds from the NIH that are could be used to find cures for things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and cancer. He's diverting those funds to answer an already answered scientific question of whether or not vaccines cause autism. Vaccines do not cause autism. This man has no business near our healthcare system. And, I hope that by me running, other physicians are watching me and realize that they are more than qualified to do this as well, because healthcare is political. Politicians have made it political, and we as healthcare providers have no choice but to get political in response.
So, Doc, this may be the first time I've ever heard anything positive about RFK Jr. taking over the position that he's in, which is that it nudged you into getting into the race against Lindsey Graham. So that's one good thing that has come from RFK Jr. Okay, let me circle back to the rule of law. What about the courts? Because right now I have been saying, and I never thought as a career fed for more than 30 years I would say this. I see the federal court judges, the trial court judges, and the courts of appeal as protecting us against a lawless, unconstitutional president, which is, it just feels bizarre. But in my opinion, that's what they're doing. Now, that is not, any comment on what's going on at the Supreme Court with the six, right wing justices. But what are your top line thoughts about what we're seeing in our federal courts every day?
I mean, that's how I feel about it as well. I feel like they're standing between this corrupt administration and the American people and the foundation of this country. My concern as an outsider is how long can that hold? How much pressure can the Trump administration put on these judges? How many of them will fold? And how long can the courts protect us from this erosion of our constitutional rights in this country? It's deeply disturbing. And, the more I think about it, the more concerned I get, as do I think most Americans. And the news is coming at us, at light speed. And I think people feel really overwhelmed, especially when we see court decisions that don't go our way, especially when we see what's happening with the Supreme Court and the politicized extremist Supreme Court. And my encouragement to folks who are listening is just use this as fuel to get engaged, to get involved, to get off the sidelines, because I don't know how to fix the court system, but I know that sitting in my living room at night scrolling on Twitter is not going to do it. So I'm out here doing the work, doing something I never was trained to do, never envisioned doing, because this moment is so urgent and it's going to continue to get more urgent. And the erosion of our system is just, probably the biggest problem we face, but just one of many problems.
Yeah, and turning our anger into action, that's one thing we can do. We can engage all day, every day, stand up, speak out, stay strong, march, rally, protest, all peacefully, because as I always say, pressure bursts pipes, and we need to keep the pressure on. Okay, let me kind of wrap up with this. The militarization of the streets of America. And there is violence that is attendant to that because we've seen abuses. I mean, our soldiers are put, and our sailors and our seamen, our Marines are put in impossibly difficult positions. The military is not allowed to enforce civilian law, but that's what they're out there doing, even when they're just standing next to ICE agents whom we know in some instances are violating the constitutional due process rights of human beings. This is a potentially democracy ending endeavor by Donald Trump, militarizing the streets of our nation. I have visions of, brother fighting on brother the way we had to do, previously in this country to try to save the Union. And Lindsey Graham, before I forget to mention him, as a former Air Force JAG officer, I was an Army JAG officer, active duty for 6.5 years, and I know people who tried cases against him back in the day. And the man has lost his way, has lost his mind, has lost his morals and his compass to the extent he ever had them. But what is your view of the militarization of the streets that Donald Trump seems to have an insatiable appetite for?
I think about it in two different ways. I think about it as, we're living through history right now. When I was in school and learning about World War II and seeing the black and white images in my history textbooks, and it's terrifying to realize that we're living through a similar moment where our country really is at risk of losing itself. And, we always grew up saying, well, what would you have done if you had been alive back then? And whatever you think you would have done then is what you need to be doing now, because this situation is just reaching a boiling point. And I think because we're so inundated with the 24/7 news cycle, we sometimes lose the forest for the trees and we don't realize how close to the edge we really are as a country. And the other way I think about this is a mom of a 10-year-old boy who dreams of growing up and being in the military. And it's really disorienting as a parent in America to not feel excited about that, to wonder, well, would I want him to join the military right now when we're seeing the way the military is being used in deeply un-American ways on the streets in California? And I just can't believe that we've fallen so far so fast. And, it's so easy. And I've said this a couple times today. I must be just feeling overwhelmed today, but it's so easy to feel overwhelmed about the state of this country. And that just makes it so much more important to find whatever way we can into this. You're using your background as a JAG officer, working in the Department of Justice to push back and to fight back and use your expertise. And I'm trying to do the same thing over here with my background in healthcare, raising alarms about how dangerous this attack on our healthcare system is, how dangerous RFK Jr. is. We've all just got to lean in more than we ever thought we would. And together we can be so powerful and we can overcome.
Yeah, engaging feels so much better than disengaging. So as hard as it is, engage in every way we can. I think that that's great advice. So, Dr. Andrews, where can people find you? How can people support your candidacy?
Yeah, I think people need to believe that I can win, that someone like Lindsey Graham can be defeated, and imagine the political shockwaves that would send through the country in November 2026 if someone who's so entrenched in Washington, D.C. and tied so tightly to Donald Trump actually loses to a Democrat in South Carolina. And I can win, and I'm so committed to doing everything possible to win, but I need everybody's support. So folks can go to drannieandrews.com, sign up to volunteer because you can phone bank and text bank from anywhere. Throw me a few dollars of a donation, whatever you can. We have donors from all 50 states. It's going to take us all to defeat someone who's so tied to the dark money like Lindsey Graham is. And then follow along with this journey with me on social media. I'm on every platform, Annie Andrews, MD. I'm easy to find. But we've got to run everywhere, and we can't win if we don't run. And so I do not believe that we should sit out these races in red states like South Carolina. And I'm so engaged in this race and so confident about our ability to change the tide for this country, but I need folks with me to do that.
I really appreciate you not only being with our Justice Matters viewers today, but stepping out of your profession and maybe even your comfort zone to take on, a fight that needs to be fought against the guys like Lindsey Graham who have done nothing but facilitate the destruction of American democracy. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but when he continues to support Donald Trump, who on January 6th, in a very real sense, tried to end American democracy. And Lindsey Graham seems to be all in with that. Well, these are the problems that we really need to tackle. And I appreciate you jumping into the fight. And I am urging all of our Justice Matters viewers to please go to Dr. Andrews' website, consider supporting her candidacy. And, I'm sure that will go a long way. So, Doc, thank you for being with me. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much for having me.